Mr. Loomis. In this final lesson of our introductory unit, we're going to learn about slavery and the Civil War. Slavery and the effects of slavery are so important for understanding the United States and its people. Even today, this is still something that people care deeply about. The Civil War itself, ending slavery, is an important turning point in our country's history. This is why it is the end of what you studied in your last American history class and the start of what we will study this year. Let's begin by previewing our topics. We'll discuss slavery and why the growth of the country made slavery a problem that ended up in a war. We'll talk about the war itself and why the North was able to win. Then we'll spend a little time learning about one of the greatest presidents in American history, Abraham Lincoln. And finally, we'll talk about a time called Reconstruction, which came after the Civil War and still has important effects on us today. Let's get started. To understand why Americans fought a civil war, we have to know about slavery. As we already learned, slavery had been a part of American history since just after the arrival of the first English settlers in the 1600s. By the middle of the 1800s, America was becoming a rich country by growing and selling cotton. In the North, factory owners were making fabric and clothing out of cotton from the South. In the South, plantation owners sold their cotton to factory owners in the North and also to people in Europe. Cotton was so important to America that it was called king cotton, and slaves did all the work to grow it. In the early years after the United States had become a country, the founding fathers had thought that plantation owners in the South would stop using slaves as workers on their own. However, the invention of a machine called the cotton gin put an end to that hope. The cotton gin made it easy and fast to take the seeds out of raw cotton, and plantation owners in the South created new fields so they could grow and sell more. And to work in these new fields, they wanted more slaves. Instead of going away, slavery became so important to the economy that few leaders in the North or South could imagine a way to get rid of slavery without ruining the whole country. Slavery was also important to the social order of the South. There were only a few rich whites who owned slaves. So for most whites, thinking that they were better than African Americans and thinking that someday they might be rich enough to buy a slave was a signal of social standing. Southerners said that slaves were actually better off than the free workers of factories in the North because slaves always had a place to live, food, and work. But none of these Southerners offered to trade places with the slaves, which shows that they probably didn't believe their own arguments. In the early 1800s, a movement began to end slavery. This was called the Abolition Movement. It did not start by itself. In fact, at that time in history, people were excited about fixing all kinds of problems. There were reform movements about alcohol and religion going on as well. The most important abolitionists were William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Abolition was not popular at first, and many abolitionists were attacked and some were killed. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was a bestseller, and after reading it, many Northerners decided that slavery was wrong. Her book was banned in the South. Many slaves ran away from their owners using a system of safe houses called the Underground Railroad. As part of a larger deal, Congress passed a law that required Northerners to help catch runaway slaves. This made Northerners, who thought slavery was wrong, really angry. You learned about westward expansion in the last lesson. The expansion of the United States made problems that led to the Civil War. As the country grew, leaders had to decide if slavery would be allowed in the new lands or not. The real reason this was a problem was that it was connected to the balance of power between slave states and free states in the Senate. The House of Representatives would always be unbalanced because many more people lived in the North. But for 40 years, keeping an equal number of slave states and free states had kept the country together. So long as there were the same number of slave and free states, one part of the country could never be more powerful than the other. After the Mexican-American War, the biggest question was if slavery was going to be legal in the Mexican Cession. The Wilmot Proviso was a law that banned this, but it was not passed. The fight over the proviso made Northerners think that slave power was taking over the government. One idea to solve this problem was called popular sovereignty. This idea was to take the fight about slavery in the new lands out of Congress and give it to the people. Under popular sovereignty, the people of each new state, would vote for themselves to decide if they would be free or a slave state. This was put to the test with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and led to a time called Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery, anti-slavery people fought in Kansas. In the 1850s, the Supreme Court tried to solve the question of slavery. One slave, Dred Scott, had gone to court against his owner after his owner took him into the North. Dred Scott said that because he was in a free state, he was free. The Supreme Court ruled in Dred Scott v. Sanford that he was not. This decision did not solve the problem. Instead, it meant that any slave owner could take slaves into free states, and so slavery could be spread into all the states. The Dred Scott case scared many Northerners, but other events scared Southerners. Also in the 1850s, a man named John Brown attacked an army station in Harper's Ferry in Virginia. He wanted to use the guns he stole to start a slave uprising. In the end, he failed and he was captured, put on trial, and hung for treason. John Brown became a martyr for the abolitionist cause. Northerners might have seen the Dred Scott case as proof that slave power was taking over the government, but Southerners thought John Brown's attack showed that abolitionists would do anything to take away their slaves. In the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln won as the first Republican president. He was not on the ballot in any Southern state. Southerners thought his victory was proof that the North would do anything to get its way, and that the South, with fewer people, would be the losers in the end. 11 Southern states seceded and started the Confederate States of America. 4 slave states chose not to secede and stayed in the Union. Lincoln took office hoping to keep the country together, but warned the South that if they tried to leave, it would mean war. When Southerners attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the Civil War began. The North and South each had strengths and weaknesses going into the Civil War. The North had more people, more factories, more money. However, the North had to take the fight to the South and win. The South just had to hold out until the North gave up. The Southerners saw themselves as fighting for their freedom, which helped them get men to sign up at the start of the war. Later, Northerners saw their armies as fighting to end slavery, a good cause of their own. Most of the Army's best generals were from the South. This hurt the North in the first years of the war, until they were able to find new generals. Both sides thought it would be a short war. After the first battles, it became clear that this was not true. Although the Union General McClellan was good at planning and training the Army, he did not want to send them into battle and failed to destroy the smaller Confederate Army early in the war, even when he had the chance. In the North, the war led some to become rich. The government spent a lot of money on guns, uniforms, and other equipment for the war, which led to many new factories being built. Although many men wanted to join the Army at the start of the war, Lincoln started to draft as the war went on, which led to rioting. To prevent the South from selling its cotton to Europe, the North used the Navy to create a blockade of Southern ports. The blockade also stopped ships from bringing food into the South. Women rioted because there was no food to buy. In both the North and the South, the rich found ways to avoid the Army, while women ended up in new roles in industry, farming, and the war effort. The Red Cross was started by women during the war. The turning point of the war was the Battle of Gettysburg. Southern General Robert E. Lee led his army into the North to try to force the North to give up. Although no one won the battle, Robert E. Lee lost more men than he could replace, and it was the last time he would try to take his army into the North. At the same time, Union armies in the South took control of the city of Vicksburg and were able to control all the Mississippi River. This split the South in half. It took 2 more years of fighting after Gettysburg for the North to finally win the war. General William T. Sherman led his Union Army through Georgia, destroying everything he could in the first example of modern total war. General Ulysses S. Grant of the North finally destroyed the Confederate capital of Richmond and forced General Lee to surrender. Of course, the war was about slavery, but it had many layers of meaning to the people who lived through it, and also to Americans ever since. The North and the South both thought their side was fighting for what was right. Northerners fought the war to keep the country together. Later in the war, they started to think that they were fighting to end slavery. Southerners said they were fighting for freedom from control by the North, and both sides thought God was on their side. Partway through the war, Abraham Lincoln, or President Lincoln, wrote and signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This law freed slaves in places that were fighting against the government. So it did nothing for slaves in the 4 border states that had not joined the Confederacy, or in territory that the Union Army had already taken over. However, it inspired slaves in the South to run away and gave the North a moral reason for the war. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is remembered as one of the great speeches of American history. In it, he explained how the Civil War was connected to the Revolution back in 1776. The phrase, 70 years ago, is about the Declaration of Independence. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln showed his idea that forgiveness was important, and he wanted to rebuild the South without punishing the Southerners. He described the war as a punishment from God against all Americans for slavery, and questioned if anyone could really say God was on their side. Lincoln was killed 2 days after the South surrendered. Instead of the war starting up again, as those who planned the killing had hoped, it left the country without a strong leader. Andrew Johnson, the vice president who took over, was from Tennessee and was hated by the Republicans who led Congress. They argued with him again and again about how to rebuild the South. After the war, Northerners got on with their lives. In the North, you could hardly tell there had been a war at all. In the South, most cities had been destroyed. Southerners were surrounded by newly freed former slaves. Reconstruction was very difficult for the South. African Americans celebrated the end of the Civil War, but faced a lot of problems. Many began looking for lost loved ones. Some hoped to have simple things, such as a little land to live on. During the war, General Sherman had promised 40 acres and a mule, but this did not happen. Most became sharecroppers, working on the same land they did as slaves and giving a part of what they grew as rent. Others worked someone else's land and paid rent. This new system was only a small step above slavery. Leaders in the North had different ideas about the right way to rebuild the South. Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, the new president, wanted to quickly bring the South back into the Union and forgive Southerners who had fought for the Confederacy. Johnson pardoned Southern leaders and returned their property except their slaves. Radical Republicans in Congress wanted to punish Southern leaders and do more to change the social order of the South. They promoted African Americans and spent money to open schools to teach freedmen. They impeached President Johnson when he tried to stop them. He kept his job by 1 vote, but leadership of Reconstruction switched from the president to Congress. After the Civil War, the country made 3 amendments or changes to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th gave citizenship to anyone born in the United States. The 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote. These 3 amendments are still important today. Even though there were some good changes for African Americans during Reconstruction, white Southern leaders retook control of their states. They passed laws to stop African Americans from voting. Groups such as the KKK killed African Americans who wanted to have equal rights and scared others. Reconstruction ended in 1877 when Republicans and Democrats compromised. A Republican, Hayes, was elected president, and Northern soldiers left the South. Without the army to make them follow the new laws passed by the radical Republicans, white Southern leaders took over and started the Jim Crow system of segregation. Over time, Redeemers worked to change the meaning of the war They tried to make people forget that the war was about slavery and tried to get people to think that Southerners were fighting for freedom. The South may have lost the war, but they won the peace. Let's finish by reviewing today's big ideas. Slaves were brought to America from the very beginning of the English colonies. When they created the United States in the 1770s, the Founding Fathers couldn't find a way to get rid of slavery, so they let it continue. The work done by slaves helped white Americans become rich and helped the country develop in both the North and the South. By 1860, the North and South could no longer agree on what to do about slavery. The biggest problem was if slavery was going to be allowed in the new lands in the West. As a result, the South tried to leave and create a new country. The North went to war to stop them. The Civil War was long and terrible. In the end, the North won because it had more people, more money, and more industry. For Northerners, the war was about keeping the country together and about ending slavery. The North tried to rebuild the South after the war and make a society that was more equal. They passed laws to give former slaves rights. In the end, however, white Southerners retook control of the government and took these rights away from African Americans. Thank you very much. That concludes our introduction. You learn about the first English people who came to America, how they fought against England and created the United States, how white Americans spread all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and now how Northerners and Southerners fought over the question of slavery. Now that you've gone through all the lessons, make sure you watch the review video. Use the Quizlet sets to remind yourself of all the events, people, and ideas you've talked about, and use the study guide so you'll be ready for your test. Good job, and I'll see you next time.